Welcome to Distracted, the podcast with Angela Lockwood, the place where you will find practical brain-boosting strategies, expert insights, and real-life stories to help busy brains thrive in the age of distraction. Let's go. Welcome to Distracted. I'm Angela Lockwood, and I am joined today by a very special guest. I have to admit, I was probably fangirling a little bit off air, too much to my guest discomfort maybe. But today I'm joined by Dr. Tim Sharp. Now, some of you would be very familiar with that name, and you'd be already locked in, going, "Yes, I'm here. This is exactly what I want to, who I want to listen to." But some of you might have heard not the name, but his other name, which is Dr. Happy. And I remember hearing that name many, many years ago, thinking that is the coolest name I have ever heard. I want a name like that. Haven't quite come up with it because Dr. Happy is the best one. And I can't wait to jump into everything happiness today. But Dr. Tim Sharp is the founder and chief happiness officer, another cool name, of the Happiness Institute. And that's Australia's first and largest organisation dedicated to enhancing happiness. So I am so excited to jump into the theme of happiness today, but also his latest book, Lost and Found. But Dr. Tim Sharp, welcome to Distracted.
Thanks so much for having me. Thanks for that lovely introduction.
Oh, look, I really mean it. I have to admit, when you did say yes about coming on to Distracted, it was one of those moments where I was like, yes, this is such a great man I want to speak to, because not only the realism of what you do, it's very practical. It is life-changing for people, but also your commitment to a topic that really people find, strive for their whole life. And what I find interesting about you is you've been striving your whole life to also help in that topic. So I just want to thank you and acknowledge you for the work that you do in trying to make the world a better place.
Oh, thanks. That's lovely. Thank you very much. I'm flattered.
Well, look, I really want to jump into now, for people who are looking at this on our YouTube channel, there are beautiful books in the background. The book that is the new release from Tim is Lost and Found. Now, I love that title. It is such a beautiful, captivating title. Can you tell us a little bit about what Lost and Found is about, and how and why now was the time for you to write it? Because you've written so many books. Why this and why now?
There's a couple of ways I can answer that. I guess why write another book is a question I've often been asked. And I guess the simple answer is I love writing. So it's something I've always loved to do. I've been lucky enough to have had a degree of success in there, and a number of publishers who said yes to my ideas. But I'm just constantly, I almost always on a daily or weekly basis have ideas. Obviously not all of them come to fruition or come to life for a variety of reasons. But the idea behind Lost and Found had been brewing, I suppose, for quite a while now, in different guises, and I couldn't quite, get my head around how it would best come to life. The original title actually there's an interesting story behind the title, because originally my pitch to the publishers, the title was originally called Get Dirty, and there was going to be a very strong focus on being outdoors, on getting dirty, literally on nature therapy, and that's still a part of it. I mean, we might come back to that later. But to cut a long story short, the publishers loved the idea, but when the discussion sort of got a bit further, the marketing department got a bit concerned that it might be misconstrued or misunderstood in some way. And so we went back to the drawing board and bounced around a few other ideas. And I'm really glad we did. I was initially disappointed because I love that title too, Get Dirty. But I'm really glad we did, because in going back to the drawing board, coming up with a new title, which I love even more, but it also broadened the scope of the book. So again, nature therapy is a part of it. I talk a lot about that because there's some wonderful benefits, and I think a lot of us aren't getting outside enough. But it's also about a lot more than that. So it's about making mistakes. It's about embracing failure. It's about embracing the dark side almost to find the light, and even, dare I say it, the lostness of our psychology, which is, maybe just a metaphorical way of describing negative emotions or unpleasant emotions and discomfort. So it's kind of about all of that, and recognizing that these aren't just normal parts of life. I mean, they are, we all fail, we all make mistakes, but they're actually things we could embrace, because there's good in that if we approach it the right way.
When I saw the title, and I it almost felt like I could take a breather. I could take a big breath. And it felt to me, I don't know if you've had people share this with you, but it was almost permission to be okay to be lost. So in those moments where, because we're in a culture, as you know, of striving and achievement and success, and seeing your book and reading its contents, it's almost like hey guys, it's okay not to have all the answers. It's okay to give yourself some space. Is that what some of the themes are that you hoped for?
Oh, look, I'm so glad to hear that actually, because I guess that's sort of the second part of my earlier answer. Is that why did I write this book? Because I spent most of my life, trying to be an expert, trying to find the answers, trying to achieve and accomplish, like so many of us had. And I guess, and to some extent, I have, developed some expertise and come up with some answers, and maybe achieved a few things along the way. But I often felt lost. I often felt like I was, that imposter syndrome, and I felt like I was a fraud. And I suppose this is part of, because it's part memoir as well. So it's part of me coming to terms with the fact that that's okay. It's okay not to be okay. It's okay to get lost, even if you studied and read a billion things, even if you are sort of relatively expert in whatever area it might be. None of us is perfect. None of us ever knows everything. But as you hinted at in your question, our society, we don't talk much about that, and yet it's very, very common feeling to not really have a clue sometimes, or to take a wrong turn sometimes. And I talk about many of the wrong turns I took that actually ended up in the right place. So yes, that's again, I'm really pleased to hear you describe that, because that's very much a reflection of my journey, I suppose, and as I've come to learn, many other people's as well.
I know one of my frustrations when I look to, I guess, leaders or experts in their field is that this, I guess, a misconception or an image that they've gotten there through hard work, that they only seem to find happiness or seem to find space to reflect when they've already achieved whatever it is that they set out to achieve. Very rarely do we have people along the way share, hey, I'm really struggling with this. But yet this is my next step that I'm going to take. So for you, it's interesting to hear that you've had some of those challenges along the way yourself. And I'm just really interested in exploring a little bit more that sense of wandering. So I love that. And, the tagline of the book is how to wander your way to a better life. And it's just so beautiful. Can you explore that what that concept means? What does wandering mean? And how can people embrace that in their day-to-day life?
Yeah, a great question. But even if I go back a few steps to a comment you made a bit earlier about getting there, I mean, getting where?
Yeah.
Where do we want to get to in life? I know this isn't everyone, but I do know there's a lot of people who share. I was brought up, in a very sort of goal-focused, goal-oriented way, and I think a lot of us were. Our education system and much of our society and our culture is based around the idea of you set your goals, you work towards your goals, you achieve, and that's success. And look, don't get me wrong, there's a lot of good in that. I've enjoyed a lot of successes, for want of a better word, but I've also felt, with many of my achievements, I mean, I distinctly remember, for example, when I finished my PhD, which is just one example, but that's one thing I talk about. And I was working full time, so I'd worked at this was really hard work for 3.5 years on top of a full time job, and newly married and all these things. And I distinctly remember the day walking into the university, handing in these printed and bound copies, and then just thinking, is that it? I mean, there was nothing. There were no dancing girls. There were no trumpets. There was no singing. There was no hallelujahs. And it was that was I mean, that's just one example, but I think many of us have had some version of that. So this whole idea of getting there, I mean, I think is a little bit of a myth, I think, or it can actually. And what it can also do is take us away from the journey along the way. And it's that idea of the journey and the destination. But also, the idea that even if we do see good in getting there, and there is good in achievement, the idea that it would just be this linear sort of perfect line is, again, a myth. Anyone that's achieved anything of significance will know that there was, mistakes along the way, stumbles and falls and detours. And to come back to your question, I guess that's what it's about. It's about, the idea of wandering is about accepting and embracing that, and even actively pursuing wrong turns. Because, I mean, how many of us, has anyone out there listening ever made a mistake, but then learned something from it and become better in some way? We've grown stronger, we've become wiser or more resilient. That's a version of wandering. those mistakes and stumbles along the way, those failings even, can turn out to be good if we learn from them in the right way.
Mm. It's been interesting watching the Olympics unfold, and it's very striving based. It's very obviously goal outcome. There's very tangible rewards to that. But what I'm noticing, Tim, is how many athletes are coming on social media who haven't won the gold and are being really open about their feelings around, well, I didn't achieve, however, I learnt this along the way. And I've never seen that before. I've never seen that openness. And maybe it is access through social media, but are you seeing a shift in people being aware, at least, that the outcome is not always the end goal, that it's the learning along the way that's actually the achievement?
Well, I think there's actually a couple of really interesting points within that question. One, I've loved sport all my life, and I do think we can learn a lot from sport. There's no doubt about it. As a lot of speakers, a lot of keynote speakers, we use examples, but I also think it's important to state that for most of us, elite level sport is not life, and there are some significant differences. So, in elite level sport, in Olympic sport, for example, winning the gold medal is almost everything. That's what these people work for, not just 4 years, but often 10, 20, or their lives. But for most of us, it's not quite the same as that. So I do think it's important. Yes, we can learn from it, but there are important differences. So the other thing is there is some interesting research when looking at Olympic Games to say, obviously people that win gold medals are happy. The unhappiest people are the silver medalists, which is interesting. So bronze medalists are actually happier than silver medalists because gold medal is obvious, I won. Silver medalists think, yes, I got a medal. Bronze medalists think, yes, I got a medal. The silver medalists think they missed out on gold. Bronze medalists don't tend. So there's an important lesson in that, I think, and it's all about how we frame these things. And I guess that's coming back to your question. It's how we frame not being okay. There's definitely been a greater awareness. I think I said this earlier, the hashtag "it's okay not to be okay" has become very popular probably for a decade or so now. And I guess I have a bit of a love-hate relationship with social media hashtags because by definition, they oversimplify. And that's, that can be problematic, but they could also be catchy and get attention. And I think that's certainly one of the better ones because it does encapsulate in just a few short words a very important message. It is okay not to be okay. And I think that's actually, to go back to your question, that is broadening now. It's not just about mental ill health. I guess that's a big part of the message in my book, that it's okay, not just that it's okay not to be okay, but it's okay not to have a clue. It's okay to feel lost. It's okay not necessarily to know exactly who you are or where you want to get to. Some people find that, and if they do early in life, good luck to them. That's fantastic. But for me, I'm still struggling at times. I think I found it at times, and then I realized that it's not quite what I expected it to be. I've had some of the greatest successes in my life have turned out not necessarily to be successes because they weren't what I thought they were going to be. They didn't give me what I thought they would give me. And I suppose, again, that's a big part of what the book's about. And I suppose in sharing some of my story and in sharing the research behind it, I hope it'll help some other people feel a bit okay about being lost as well.
Yeah. And even that sense of lost doesn't mean lost forever, does it? It's just, it doesn't mean that you're lost forever. But I do have a question that I guess I need to try to say it as clearly as possible so I don't get lost in the question myself. But is there
That's okay if you get lost in the question.
I probably will. I probably will. Is there a point where wandering and being lost can tip over into distraction and apathy? So, I work a lot in the world of distraction and people feeling like they're flipping from one thing to the next and they can't concentrate on something deep. Or, they try, maybe an entrepreneur who might try something and feel like they're getting frustrated with not being able to focus on something. Is there a balance between the two of wandering and being distracted? Or sometimes, I don't know the question, but I'm going to hand it over to you.
We'll try and find a way through it.
Find a way through it, that's
right.
right.
I think it's actually, there is a fantastic question in there somewhere. And I think the simple answer is yes. I guess my answer is that, like with pretty much everything in life, has pros and cons. Almost everything has good and bad within it and about it. And distraction is actually a good example of that. So distraction can definitely be problematic. There's no doubt about it. Many of us use distraction, for example, to avoid it's a form of avoidance to avoid feeling unpleasant emotions. So as soon as we get a bit upset or even just bored, for example, what do? We reach for our smartphones, we start scrolling through social media or news or whatever it might be, which is not entirely bad. But if that's a way of avoiding unpleasant emotions, then we're not really dealing with something that probably needs to be dealt with. So again, coming back to the question, there's no doubt that distraction in that context and in other contexts as well can be problematic. However, I think we need to be careful that we don't throw out the baby with the bathwater, because letting our minds wander can be extremely useful. I think and that's kind of beaten out of us in school. If you were one of those kids who were sitting in the classroom and you were staring out the window, sort of daydreaming, you would probably get in trouble. That was seen as a negative behaviour. But it shouldn't necessarily. There's some really good research, and I cite some of this research in the book about how daydreaming, how letting our minds wander, can actually be associated with and can boost creativity. And creativity can be associated with innovation and problem solving and all sorts of other benefits. So, I guess to come back to your question, yes, there's good and bad. Yes, there's pros and cons. And yes, that's the challenge, is taking the good out of distraction, taking the good out of wandering, and managing the bad, I suppose, not letting the negative aspects overwhelm or override the positive ones.
What a great answer to my non-question. I knew you'd know what to do with that, Tim. I'm interested too about stage of life. So a lot of times people in their middle age, whatever that band of age is nowadays, is there an element of people questioning their journey and questioning, am I on the right path? Is there a path at all? Sort of, I guess, those bigger existential questions that often people will ask in their middle years. Is it an age and stage thing, or is it just a natural part of?
Again, a great question, and I think it's both. However, the only thing, I'm always a little bit reluctant to talk about those sort of age stage things, because I think it's not necessarily purely about the number. Different people will get to different stages at different ages, I guess. But I'm very much in that middle age period, and some of the questions that I've been, that I am answering and that I ask in the book, I suppose, I probably wouldn't have asked it, in my teens or early 20s, when it was, I was very much focused on accomplishment and achievement, and that's pretty normal at that stage. In some ways, I wish I'd had this wisdom earlier, but I couldn't possibly have. You can't, and that's, so we need to be careful about using hindsight, because that can be very dangerous. I couldn't have written this book 20 years ago. I just couldn't have. I didn't have the wisdom. I didn't have the perspective, the bigger picture. So even, and I suppose that's what it's also about. When I look back and look at all the mistakes I made and all the wrong turns I made, it would be very easy to say, I wish I didn't do that. But if I hadn't done that, I wouldn't have been where I am now, and I wouldn't be doing some of the work I'm been doing now. So it's about sort of, I suppose, having that wisdom to recognize that we were dumb and stupid when we were younger. But that's okay. And when I say that to my kids now, and I don't mean that in a bad way. I really think we need to let our kids be dumb and stupid, for those of us who are parents. I say that to my kids, not necessarily in those words, but they need to make mistakes. They need to be able to, how could you possibly learn what you like and don't like if you don't try different things? And if you try different things, well, not everything's going to work. So again, that's that idea of lost and found. If we never allow ourselves to get lost, if we never allow ourselves to try new things, to experiment, take risks, well, we'll never find out what's real or not.
You talk a lot about comfort zone and sort of stretching that and stepping out of comfort zone. Can you explore that a little bit more for our listeners? What does that look like in practice in just normal day-to-day life? It's not necessarily about jumping off a cliff or, doing something dramatic. What does it look like in the sort of humdrum, normal runnings of life?
Yeah, well, I do talk about. So one of the stories I do share is when I jumped out of an airplane, which I'll preface by saying it's definitely not for everyone. I mean, my wife, for example, was just not interested at all, would never consider it, and that's fine. A lot of people won't. But I shared the example because what it was for me, and for many people who've skydiving, bungee jumping, any of those sorts of things, it was at once, at the same time, the most terrifying moment of my life, but also the most exhilarating moment of my life. And so I shared that example of saying that sometimes, without fear and anxiety and even terror, we can't have the joy and excitement and exhilaration. And it doesn't need to be that extreme. Even at sort of lesser intense versions, the same sort of principle applies. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not opposed to comfort. Comfort's a wonderful thing. And, I recently did a project through winter based on Hygge, this Danish principle. And I write a bit about Hygge, which is a Danish, kind of like a version of happiness, but it's really about comfort, particularly in the winter months. And it's about being comfortable and wrapping yourselves in a blanket and eating nice hot stews and those sorts of things. And there's a lot we can learn from that. So comfort's not a bad thing. But again, there's good and bad in everything. And if we only spend, or if we spend all of our time just seeking comfort, that will be a fairly limited life. And at the worst extreme, it'll be boring and mundane and repetitive. So if we want to try anything new, which I think many of us do, then by definition, when we try things new, it will be even just a little bit uncomfortable. Because we don't know what we're doing necessarily. We won't get it right the first time. We certainly won't get it perfect if we're trying something new. And so it's that sort of discomfort which I encourage people to embrace, even if it's in a minor form. Again, it doesn't have to be jumping out of an airplane, but just trying a new hobby, learning a new skill. Because in doing so, that's how we can grow. And if we want to grow and become better, whether happier, healthier, whatever it might be, then we do need to do a little bit of that. But you can do it in small steps, and that's important. So everyone has a different risk profile.
So what are some, well, I don't want to give away too much content in the book because people need to go and buy it, if not just to sit there and look at the beautiful cover. The content of it, it literally is, Tim, something that can change people's lives. The content that you have in there, and I hope it does for many people for you, because there are a lot of people who are lost in a way that is not freedom. It's not about space for them. I think there's a lot of people that are wandering, lost, looking for answers. So I think your book has some great strategies and some great story in there to support them. What I'm wondering for people is, those people, are there sort of signs for people who feel lost but stuck at the same time? Are there things or markers for people to go, oh, hang on, I think something needs to change right now?
Yeah, it's a great question. And it's actually, I'm glad you asked that, because we had I had multiple discussions with the publishers about how practical to make this book, because all of you mentioned earlier, I have written a few other books, and all of my early books have been very practical, very much how to 100 Ways to Happiness, for example. So and I've been very proud about them, because that was what I wanted to do, is really give people clear, simple instructions, instructions for living life. But I also wanted this one to be a bit different, for a number of reasons, partly because of the theme of the book about being lost. And I specifically didn't want to make it prescriptive. But in the discussions through the editing process, my publisher said, well, what about if at the end of each chapter we just put a few takeaway tips? And we had a lengthy discussion. We went backwards and forth. And long story short, we decided not to do that, because I didn't want to make it prescriptive, for a number of reasons. One, again, because of the nature of the book. It's about finding yourself through lostness. But also, we're just all so different. And I guess that's one of the other things that's sort of part of this book is, whereas my previous books have been very prescriptive, and I think there's a lot of value in them, the same things won't work for different, what works for me won't work for you necessarily, and won't work for the next people. So I guess the answer is, I do provide prompts to encourage people to question themselves and try things to then learn their own way, find their own way. So it's definitely a lot less directive than my previous works.
I find that really interesting. I almost get like a tightness in my chest even hearing you say that, Tim. I know there's been moments in my life where I've been lost, and I've sought counsel from experts in the field in lots of different ways. And I always know the thing that I have always struggled with the most, being somebody and I've had to learn, somebody who's very head driven in the past and somebody who's very goal orientated and task driven, is the strength in surrendering, the strength in being lost, the strength in going, I don't have the answers, and that I will find the answers, whatever they are, or at least guidance through the wandering. I would love to know, what are some of the things that you do, and that, you are Dr. Happy. You've got so much expertise and credibility in happiness. It's something that many people strive for. What are some of the practices that you have in your own life to help you stay on the journey of whatever that looks like for you?
Well, I am known as Dr. Happy, as you said. But one of the things I write a lot about in the book is my personal experience with mental ill health. So I've actually been very unhappy for a lot of my life, to be honest, particularly depression and anxiety, with some quite extreme moments of suicidality. And I share a lot of this. I'm a very private person, so it's not necessarily something I kind of want to do. But I also know that I'm in a position that might be able to help some other people, because these are incredibly common. I mean, it's become very common in recent years to share lived experiences of mental ill health, and I think that's fantastic. It's very, very powerful for people to see. I mean, I'm not referring to myself here, but when famous people come out, for example, and talk about their experiences, as we've seen in recent years, that makes a massive difference to people out there, if for no other reason to think, well, I'm not alone. I mean, I know my daughter, for example, like Selena Gomez has been particularly famous with the younger generation, and there's been lots and lots of people over recent years, and I do think that's very powerful. So, in my own way, I do think I can play a role. But one of the things we haven't talked a lot about, so people have talked about depression and anxiety, but suicidality still hasn't really been talked. There's still a lot of stigma around that, and yet it's something that a significant number of people, like millions of Australians each year, will have self-harm thoughts, and we still don't talk about it. So I do talk a lot about that. And to come back to your question about what do I do, well, it's not just about what do I do to be happy, but what do I do to ward off or to manage some of my really dark moments. Now, there are some very practical things I do, which I can answer with, and that's the big ones. There's lots of things, and I should also say what I do now is slightly different to what I did 5 years ago or 10 years ago, or it's evolved because I've changed, etc. So, the really things that I do that really help me are exercise, for example. Exercise is a potent antidepressant and stress buster. Going back to the idea earlier about getting dirty, bushwalking and hiking and camping, for me, is a powerful, powerful strategy. That's one of the most effective things. If I haven't been out in nature for a significant period of time, I notice that it really affects me. Meditation. Every day I meditate. Every day I practice. I've got a gratitude journal, a journaling practice. And then some of the other ones that I try to do that I struggle with a bit more is staying connected. My default, I'm an introvert, which people find hard to believe because I spend a lot of my time standing on stage speaking to hundreds or thousands of people. But my default reaction is to withdraw and lock myself up with a good book, I suppose, which isn't a bad thing to do. But I do have some wonderful people around me, my wife and children particularly, and I need to actually work on staying connected to them and being present with them. So that's the things like that. But the other part of it, the less practical part, which again is I've really had to work hard to achieve, and it's a big part of this book, is acceptance. And you talked earlier about surrendering, which is similar concept in a way, but I write a lot in the book about it, again, with this idea of accepting that it's okay not to be okay. So whereas in the past, if I was having a depressive episode, I would work really hard. I'd fight it really. And again, I'm not saying this is a bad thing. Particularly cognitive behavioral strategies, I would work really hard to challenge my thoughts and to get active. And I still do a lot of that. But I also, for me, in more recent years, it's become more helpful to accept, to know that I'm going to have some really bad times in my life. That's who I am. I can manage it better, but I'll never get rid of it. Some people might be able to, but I'll never be able to totally eliminate the depression and anxiety from my life. And whereas in the past I might have seen that as a failure, I've now just seen it's part of who I am, and it's also part of the good of who I am. So, the thing that gets me most depressed a lot of the time is I'm a very sensitive person, what's now called a highly sensitive person. I didn't know that name when I was younger. It didn't exist, but I care a lot about a lot of things, which might sound good, but it's bloody painful a lot of the time. I get really upset about a lot of things, and particularly a lot of things that are out of my control. So it's not very healthy. It's not very helpful. But the flip side of that is that I do care about people, and I do try to help people, and I do a lot of what I can to help not just my family and friends, but I volunteer to a couple of what I consider good causes and charities, and so I probably wouldn't do those good things if I didn't have that sensitivity and caringness. So accepting that that's part of who I am, and that I've got to take the good with the bad, is a big part of my more recent coping strategies.
What I love about all of that is acceptance and awareness as being really core to that. And I think that, again, just allows people to breathe a little bit, take that big deep breath and not feel so pressured by having to do all the things,
Mm.
having to do all the strategies that are out there. Before we finish off our conversation, I'd really be interested in you just expanding a little bit more on the found aspect of the book. So the book title's Lost and Found. What's the found aspect about?
Well, I suppose to go back to a point I made earlier about how we've all made mistakes. I'm pretty sure there's no one out there listening who's never made a mistake in their life. If they are, then they're probably making a mistake of not recognizing their delusions, I think. So, but at the same time, so when I do speaking, I would often ask people, has anyone ever experienced something in their life that at the time they felt was quite a negative life experience or even quite traumatic? And 99.9% of the hands go up, because we've all had some negative life experiences, of course. But I then follow that up by saying, well, okay, but out of all of those people, how many of you, after the fact, and depending on the nature of the event, it could be hours or days or weeks or months or even years, but how many of you in some way or other look back on that now and feel stronger, better, wiser, whatever? And again, almost 99% of the hands go up again. And this is this is similar to what in psychology we call post-traumatic growth. The idea that trauma or negative life events isn't always bad, or even if it's bad in the moment, we can grow from that. We know from the research that a lot of people, again, grow, they become in some way more resilient or better or stronger as a result. And I suppose that's the found bit. It's about finding, what are the lessons to be learned in being lost or in failing? What's the direction that I'm not taking when I'm lost? Or what new direction do I need to take? I suppose that's what we need to find. But also underlying all of that, recognizing that we will probably never, ever be 100% found. And that's okay.
What a beautiful theme, beautiful story for all of our listeners. Lost and Found is the book by Dr. Tim Sharp. Tim, I really feel like we could have so many more conversations, but there are so many ways that you can connect into Dr. Tim Sharp's work online. But Tim, I just want to say thank you again. I know I said this at the beginning, but for your body of work, over your career, over your life, and now in this chapter of Lost and Found, I'm sure that it's a message that people need right now. And I just thank you for sharing again the next chapter for you. Thanks so much for being on Distracted.
Oh, thanks for having me, and thanks for asking such great questions.
Thanks, Tim. That was Dr. Tim Sharp, founder and Chief Happiness Officer of the Happiness Institute, but also author of the newly released book, Lost and Found. I would strongly recommend that you go out and buy that book. I'll put all the links to everything we've talked about in the show notes for this. If there is something that we have discussed in this conversation that you feel would be really important to be shared with somebody you love and care for in your life, please share this episode. And people really, we need to rally together and support each other. And this is another great tool to allow people to show you that you care. Thanks everyone for joining us. I'm Angela Lockwood. Thanks for being on Distracted.